how do these techniques work? So here I have a very, very high-level overview. And I'm just going to take the example of the Certora Prover itself. But a lot of the other techniques use something similar. So you have some code. So imagine that being some smart contract that you wrote in Solidity. And you have something called a specification. And these tools like the Certora Prover are going to take the code, take the specification, and try to check if the code matches the specification. So one of two things will happen. Either the tool will tell you that the code matches a specification, or it will find a counterexample, which is a concrete instance where the specification is violated. Okay? So this is how a lot of these tools work. And if you want to know more about the Certora Prover itself, I encourage you to go take a look at that, the QR code over there. There's a really nice workshop being offered where you can learn more about Certora Prover. Okay, so this is really good news. So we have these really cool tools that can, analyze your code for you, and it can prevent a lot of bugs. So this is all great. But if you're a critical person, you might be saying that, well, formal verification is just guaranteeing that your code is just as buggy as the specification, right? So if you have a bug in your specification, then formal verification will not be very helpful for you, because it will just say that, the code is equally buggy. And not only that, in fact, formal verification will tell you that the code has, the same bugs as the spec and only those bugs. It doesn't give you any more or less guarantee. So what does this suggest? This suggests that perhaps we should take some time and evaluate the specifications themselves. Right? Before we actually even verify our code, we should make sure that the specification itself is correct. So that's what this talk will tell you. So we are going to look at one specific technique that you can use to improve and evaluate your formal specifications. Okay, so before going any further, I want to give you a small example. So maybe some of you have actually seen something like this. So this is a smart contract in Solidity, and it's doing board accounting. So it's a voting mechanism. And you can read about it more later, but I'll give you enough information in this talk for you to follow along. So what's happening here? So we have the name of the contract, which is Borda. And we have this function called vote. Right? So vote is taking 3 addresses, first, second, and third. And we're going to vote to all these addresses. So what is this code doing? So first we have these require statements. And so first we have these require statements. The first one says that, the message sender should not have already voted, right? And the second one says that the candidates should all be different. Anyway, so the second line there, which you can't see, but yeah, great. The second line says the candidates should all be different. And then in the third line is where the actual voting happens. So, before that happens, you just set the voted status of the message sender to true. And then you just vote, right? So you give the first candidate a vote of 3, the second one 2 and 1, and so on. And so that's really simple. And we also have this other function called voted. And voted is just simply returning the voted status of some address. So this is a very simple program. Now, what are some interesting properties about this program that we should make sure are true? So here are some that I could come up with. So one property that is useful is perhaps we should make sure that everybody votes just once. Another property is that we should make sure that when we count the votes of the candidates, we are doing it right? So when a candidate gets a vote, that should be increased. Another important property is that the winner should have the most number of votes, right? That's pretty obvious. One other property is that maybe the voting order should not matter, right? Like I can be voting in any order, but still the winning candidate should always be the same. And the final property that I could think of is everybody should get a chance to vote, right? Like no other address should be able to control your ability to vote. So these are some properties that you can check using formal verification. But now the question is this enough? Like, did I think this through? Like, are these all the properties that actually matter? Or are there some properties that I forgot? And more importantly, this is written in English, right? So if you want to do formal verification, you want to first convert that to some logical representation. And that representation can also have bugs in it. So we have built this tool called Gambit, and Gambit is a mutation testing tool. So what is mutation testing? It's a way to automatically introduce bugs in your code so that you can check whether the specification catches those bugs. So this is actually a pretty well-known technique in the software engineering community, and we have been using this for formal verification. And so what Gambit does is it stress tests your formal specifications to give you more confidence that it will actually, in fact, catch bugs in real life. So how does it actually work? So you give it your original Solidity program, and it's going to generate some mutants for you, right? So it's going to modify the code in simple ways to generate a bunch of mutants. And these mutants have a few properties. So the mutants themselves are actually simple. They have only one small change in each mutant. And the mutants are not generated by combining a bunch of smaller mutations, because that actually makes it hard to figure out why the mutant failed verification or passed verification. OK, so once you have generated these mutants, we will verify each of those mutants using the same original specification, right? So the specification is unchanged, but we're just going to use it to verify each of these mutants. And so again, just like we saw before, the verification is going to either tell you that it passed or it failed. So what does it mean for a mutant to pass verification? So when a mutant passes verification, it's actually bad, right? It means that something is missing in your specification, and you should go and evaluate your spec and maybe improve it. And if the mutant fails verification, what does that mean? That means that you did a good job, right? Like you wrote a good spec, and you have some evidence that if there is a real bug, that your spec will actually catch it. So let's go back to that Borda example. So here is a mutant that Gambit actually produced. So what it did is it just set the voted status of the message sender to false instead of true. And now you might be wondering that, well, when I wrote my spec, I really thought this through, right? Like I wrote some really good properties. This mutant is definitely going to be caught. Well, it turns out that it doesn't, right? So if you actually verify this program using these specifications, it's actually not going to get caught. So this mutant is going to get away. So what do? It turns out that you actually missed a property. So one property that you should add to that list of specifications is that once a person has already voted, you're really changing the status of that address to true. And this is not a property that the original list had, so you should add this, and then your specification is going to catch this mutant. So that brings me to a few different types of ways in which the specification can be wrong. So here's one. This is one example. So sometimes you just don't think about all the properties, right? So you just missed your thinking about some particular thing, and your specification is just not complete. So you can make it complete by running mutation testing and finding, introducing bugs that are not being caught, and then you can think about why it's not caught and maybe improve your specification. Another thing that can happen is that maybe you actually did think about the spec, but there was you didn't convert that properly to a logical expression, right? So maybe you're missing some assertions, or maybe you're missing some clauses in some existing assertions. And then finally, we're all humans, so we make mistakes. So you can just simply have a typo in your specification. And this will also be caught with something like Gambit or mutation testing. So these are some of the ways in which we have already seen specifications having loopholes, and running mutation testing on your specification really helps find these kinds of problems. And so as part of Gambit, we also have this really interesting visualization. So to build this visualization, we actually collaborated with a company called Evil Martians. So I highly encourage you to take a look at them. They're really good at making interactive tools. So what is this visualization doing? So this is still talking about that Borda example. So a few things are happening here. So we have these green circles. So the green circles are your specifications. So those are the properties that you actually wrote. And the gray dots that are inside the green circles, those are the mutants. So if a green dot is inside if a gray dot is inside a green circle, that means that the green circle caught the gray dot. Okay? And if you want to look at this visualization, you can check out the QR code, but you should open it on your laptop because it's not meant for like a phone. So you can see that in this case, we have whoever wrote the spec did a good job, right? So we have this additional information here, which is coverage. So coverage here really means the number of mutants you killed or your specification killed. So in this case, we actually caught all the mutants, right? So none of the mutants that we generated passed verification. So this is actually good. So you want your coverage score to be as high as possible. We also have this notion of a solo rule. So rules, by the way, are the properties that I showed you earlier. So what is a solo rule? A solo rule is a rule that catches a mutant just by itself. So there are no other rules that catch the same mutant. So you can see that we have a bunch of solo rules here. And so there's no intersection between the green circles. So if that is the case, that means that there's no overlap in the properties that are being encoded in the spec. So that's kind of an interesting metric about your specification you can get from Gambit. So on the left panel, you also see all the properties that you wrote. And here's another interesting piece of information you can get. So it's split into two groups. So you have the successful rules that caught some mutant, and you have an unsuccessful list. They didn't catch any mutant, right? So maybe this also tells you how you can change your specification and maybe not even have some properties because they're just not useful properties. And you can also click on the different patches, and you can see the actual diff of the mutant, so what was changed in each mutant with respect to the original program. And yeah, so that's the tool, right? So we've built this really interesting tool called using mutation testing called Gambit. And it does two things. It automatically generates bugs or faults in your program. And for each of those generated buggy versions, it uses your formal specification to verify them. And if you can verify some of the mutants, that's bad. You should go and improve your specification. And if you can't, that's good. You can use that as a way to give some kind of metric of how good your specification is. So thank you for your attention. So just to summarize, you can go check out the tool here. We also have pretty good documentation if you're interested to learn more about it. And feel free to talk to me if you have more questions.